So, if I had only one conclusion to draw from this forum, it's the fact that if you genuinely have very high expectations, people are apt to fulfill them and to surpass them. And this is what has happened regarding my own expectations from the forum, both from the organizational support teams and from the speakers and participants. I have been really impressed by all the interesting ideas and insights that have come out of the presentations and discussions. I've learned, but also my ideas have been changed to a great extent. And it's not very easy to change the ideas of someone who works as a professor and who has an environmentalist bent. So I'm very grateful for this, or at least I was until yesterday night, when I realized that this was putting me in a tough spot when it came to giving concluding remarks. It's completely impossible to synthesize everything that came out of it, or to give credit to all the very important things that build up to overall conclusions. In this situation yesterday night, I decided to use this morning Jeremy Bentham told us is the solution in this case. Rely on the fact that sleeping brings counsel. So I did. And when I woke up this morning, I was trying to look at the solution for the synthesis. And one word came: procrastination. At first, I was really disappointed. I thought, Laurent, this is, you had it coming. You did not prepare the conclusion because you wanted it to come from the discussions. And in fact, maybe it was just procrastination. Wow. Then I emerged from my sleep, and then I understood that it was not to me that this was addressed, but to the problem with biodiversity. What we are dealing with is a situation of procrastination, of epic proportions, of global dimensions. And this has been said with many different words during the forum. So let us delve on this idea of procrastination. Conservation biologists, many of them has a formula for them. They call it knowing but not doing. We don't do as well as we could, knowing what we know. French philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy wrote a very good book called Enlightened Catastrophism. He says, we do know, uncertainty is not the issue. We do know, but we do not believe what we know. And in his analysis, he underlines the fact that there are two different kinds of time. There is what he calls project time. I have goals, I act, I mobilize tools. And there is what he calls historic time, large-scale transformations that are many scales higher than project time. And he says that we react differently to them, and they have radically different meaning to us. We cannot act directly on historic time. So this gap is one of the components of procrastination. Procrastination is when you realize that there are big issues for you, things that might be changing, but they are not at the scale where you act usually, and you don't know how to bridge the gap to take some hold on the larger issues of what you have to confront. And a good point here is that I believe that contributing to bridging this gap is the essence of future studies. If you take a corporation, you have day-to-day management actions by people. And this has to connect with strategies at a hugely bigger scale. And future studies are one of the tools that we have to try and connect these two scales. It cannot connect them completely, but it's really one of the ways, and it deserves to get the best shot. And I'm very grateful for all the useful conclusions and orientations that we got from the breakouts from yesterday afternoon. Another thing in the forum came to me as a shock. I had not realized to what extent the four types of actors that are present in this room, that is enterprise, government, NGOs, and academia, have converged over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I've seen exchanges all the time that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. And when I looked at the list of biographies of people, I could see that many of them have occupied 2 or 3 or even 4 of the different positions. There is a convergence in the way people think. Now, personally, I'm not easily a believer in simple convergence, in the idea that if we are all on the same page, the world will change. We are not witnessing the same level of change that convergence might indicate. So, as a strategist, I have this very negatively oriented mind. So I think that the front has moved. It is not anymore between these different types of organizations. It has moved somewhere else. Where has it moved? First, inside organization. The front of change has moved inside NGOs, between different sorts of NGOs, inside corporations, inside governments, and we have to follow that action, not to be stuck with the old differentiation of actors. We have to follow this collaboration. As in one of the workshops, we followed closely the line of action from within the debates within an NGO to the debates within Monsanto, and we could have done the same from debates within academia to government to companies, etc. So we have to change the focuses of our attention to find the relevant places where strategy is happening. One message that came out screaming, you saw just before in the 5 breakout group reports, is that all situations of action now engage several of the actors together. No one is able to act alone. Again, this is a situation that often creates other forms of procrastination. Any confusion of roles creates some measure and some feeling of procrastination. So it's not very surprising that we are experiencing it on that ground too. There is another front on which the struggle, if I may, has moved. It's a front between sectors. I was completely struck by Simon Upton's diagram from OECD, which showed the amount of subsidies that are currently going to what he called brown sectors and the ones that go to green sectors. Personally, I think that as many have said, we really need to invest on the constructive side of sustainability and biodiversity. But this cannot work if at the same time you don't find the ways to curb the destructive side. This is, again, a major component of procrastination. If you get so much benefit of the behaviors that you want so badly to stop, you're stuck and you have this feeling and reality of procrastination. I'm underlying the confrontational part here because it's usually eluded. It's not because I think that problems are going to be solved in sheer confrontation. Personally, my attention is on negotiation, and negotiation is always ambiguous. It is at the same time an intense struggle and a strong effort of collaboration. So I have really realized changes in the way this is playing out that I had not anticipated before the forum. So overall, these are just a few of the conclusions. Many of them could be illustrated with fine points, technical points, research things to follow that have emerged from the forum, but I'm not here to lecture. I'll just finish by saying that this feeling and reality of procrastination that we feel with such intensity has several causes that I just enumerated. But for us to live feeling better, I will say that if we look into our own lives, some of us can testify that with significant levels of a feeling of procrastination, you still can eventually get a lot done. And I think this is what we can hope for with all the projects and programs and action that are building up on biodiversity. And thank you for all these positive examples and thoughts. So I think we have about 15 minutes for last thoughts, last discussions in plenary, observations. Those of you who have observations and ideas or insights that they would like to share, now is the time to do it. Before at 3:30 we give the floor to the artists.
Hello, I'm Peter Brotherton from Natural England. Something that's come up quite often in conversation, as opposed to from the podium, is the word regulation. And what's been brilliant is the main people who have brought it up are businesses that are represented here. And really in the context of saying that, that it would be liberating to the private sector to be able to innovate within a better regulatory regime than we have now. And that challenge of international regulation and a better world environment within which businesses feel empowered to act in our future interests better is something that hasn't come up much. And it would be, I think, a shame for that not to be captured clearly from the forum.
Thank you very much. Other comments? Maybe I'll rebound on that a little bit while others may be preparing their final observations. I'd like to say that this is one example of the synergies between business, governments, NGOs. There are new alliances. But the important point here is that we are talking mostly between people who believe that this alliance is the way forward, but the alliance is also in presence of other forces, governmental, corporate, lobbyists, or academic, that are not in favor of that compact, of that alliance. So I really think that the lines of negotiation, discussion, and construction have changed completely. And it's important that we feed the alliance that is in favor of building the sustainability across the four types of actors. Yes.
I have one observation for us who are, those of us who are basically in academia, among other things. One of the things I now observe are dueling conferences, in the sense that the problems of that conference are solved to some extent in disregard to the problems of other conferences. So I deal with I go to biofuels, bioenergy conferences, where people say, oh, well, you know, we just preserve these protected areas, that will take care of biodiversity, and then we can take the rest of the land and use it for bioenergy. And agriculture can intensify because Africa's got plenty of fresh water, and it can divert that water. And so if the kind of failing to recognize that the next conference over is talking about the crisis of the lack of fresh water, the next conference over is talking about the crisis of excess use of nitrogen and fertilization of the oceans. And of course, we're focused on biodiversity and know perfectly well that just preserving a few protected areas hardly does the job. So I think that part of the goal, one of the interesting things here is we have some senior people here. And maybe there's a policing role of the senior people to kind of scold the rest of us, even in the environmental business, who are working about each of these areas, when we neglect the conference next door. And of course, in the case of biodiversity, it tends to get the lowest rung. So for those of us particularly concerned with biodiversity, we have a particular role, I think, in making sure that all these problems are thought of together.
My reaction is two ways. First, you're absolutely right. There are large contradictions between various sorts of commitments that can be taken, and people tend to discuss on focused or sectoral problems. It's very important not to disconnect. For instance, in this forum, we found out how important it was to try and strike a balance between very open, large-scale considerations like drivers, like population development, consumption, etc., and very specific issues like biodiversity. There are many issues that are specific to biodiversity, methods that are specific to biodiversity, etc. And so it's important when we work on sustainability and environment that we do not make a radical choice between overall approaches that are going to miss the specific challenges or overly focused approaches. But the part of my answer that goes the other way is that I also believe that no one has a capacity to have a global solution for everything, and that there are contradictions that are so fundamental that not every cause is going to end up a winner. And so we have to let things play out over time, between sectors, between people who are promoting different causes. And to that extent, it's okay that people are promoting biofuels, biodiversity, population control, or lack of population control, etc., as long as these things are played out in a way that is not too destructive and that is as constructive as possible. I like your choice of words on scolding, because it's not stopping people from doing these things separately, it's just asking them to have a degree of measure in that. And so that's what I like in your choice of word. And I work in an agricultural university and I work on biodiversity, and so I know what I mean when I say this. Yes, please.
I would just like Andrew Mitchell from Global Canopy. I just want to offer another contradictory thought, and that is most of us in this room are probably not from countries where most biodiversity is. And it was Joseph de Cruz from UNDP who made a very important point that in many countries where you're dealing with poor people who are close to that biodiversity, the one thing they want to do is get away from nature. And we are all trying to walk towards it because we have lost it. And therefore, I think that the danger our perspectives may not be appropriate for everything. So I think it would be good in another time, and I know how this is difficult, to bring people who represent that view to this, a future such conference, so that we fully understand the way they think and balance that with our own thinking.
That's, I think, very important, and we can also go to the field and see how that affects us. And each of us who has worked for a long time from this position that we have here and moved to the field in contact with the problems has felt the impact that you're mentioning. Voilà. No. Yes, please.
Thanks. I've been really inspired by the way in which the conference has spoken very clearly about the way we've got to communicate about these things in the future, and particularly being, very positive, solution-oriented, and speaking about the kind of transformative change that needs to happen. I suppose that sits, in a sense, uncomfortably with, but has to sit alongside that intensification of competition that's going to happen around the limited resources that this planet has for the people who are going to inhabit it, and all the nature that equally we must make sure inhabits the planet as well for all our welfare. When we've got a situation where 80 million hectares have been acquired in sub-Saharan Africa over the past few years, that has enormous implications exactly for the people that Andrew Mitchell just spoke about. And so my plea would be, when we come out of this conference, we look to the solutions of inequality as part of the solutions also for biodiversity. And I think, we've got to find biodiversity solutions that are in synergy with the solutions for poverty reduction, precisely because of the proximity that Andrew Mitchell spoke about. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to add on a slightly different pitch, but on the same theme of having to live both with constructive and collaborative solutions and with tough struggles. The following fact: in the field of biodiversity, there are several tribes, you might say. For instance, there are the people who defend protected areas and protection. And then other people have arrived and said, this is all very bad, it doesn't work, you have to do it in a completely different way by integrating biodiversity into the way we do agriculture, we do forestry, or we do urban management and development. And then there's a third component that we've seen in our debates, which is large-scale ecological engineering, like reforestation of the Loess Plateau in China, and I think many others will have to come up. Unfortunately, most of the time, these tribes are pitted against one another, and when they are, they really play the strategy of those who want the solutions not to work. How many times have I seen people who advocate in favor of collaborative, participative conservation only to undermine the other side of measures that are trying to keep protected areas or to have regulations that work? So I have a very strong criteria in this area. When one of these approaches is there to fight the others, it's not contributing. I understand that there is competition and a certain level of debate between them, but if it goes to the point of being counterproductive to the two others, then it's really not a solution, but one more part of the problem.
Laurent, if I could offer one point which is connected to this. The subject of this conference is valuing ecosystem services, and one thing that certainly in the groups I've been in, that I haven't heard or thought captured is, in order to reward people for providing those services, we need to define who owns them. And this comes down to land tenure, which is a huge issue in many developing nations, because you can't actually know who owns the natural capital, whether it is a government or a poor community. And the legalities of that, the human rights issues, and the mere process of defining and registering those ownerships is a major barrier for taking this whole area forward, and that's something that it wouldn't be too difficult to fix. It is beginning in some countries, and it is probably the role of governments to do that.
Okay, but I would say here that it's very clear that with the limits coming closer, there is a huge issue of repartition of ownership. But I would not endorse completely an approach that would say we first have to clarify ownership and then we will find solutions. Ownership is also gradually negotiated through the solutions that we put in place. And these solutions, they have to be adapted to context, as Raphael said in his report on the marine stuff. In some areas, it is barriers and regulations that are going to stabilize and found ownership. In other areas, it is going to be reward systems and exchange systems and markets. And in other areas, it might be huge projects that will require collaboration or governmental or intergovernmental action on large scales. So I believe that we should beware of taking a one-way route, rights first, action next, or action without caring about rights. It's like a dialectic of negotiating rights as we are designing solutions that are context sensitive and use the toolboxes that we've seen. I'm sorry, I think my watch is speaking to me. It's saying it's 3:30. So again, thank you very much for these extraordinary conversation. And now I will let Sir David introduce the last sequence of the forum.